This time I look at 5 classic 4-stroke 125s. Our 125cc's. It was a capacity that was little used in Britain, well, at least not until the advent of the 125 learner law in the early 80s in the UK. On the continent, however, things were rather different, and 125s were very commonplace, with even the relatively humble 4-strokes featuring some great design and technology. And so here are 5 of them. The Honda CB125 Twin. Honda's small capacity twin cylinder range really began life with the SS's in the late 60s. These used a single overhead cam of 124cc's with a bore and stroke of 44x41. Peak power was a claimed 13 horsepower at 10,000 RPM. The engine was inclined sloper style and formed a stressed member in a pressed steel frame. However, the end of the 60s saw a major redesign, with the engine cylinders brought more upright, and there was now a tubular steel frame and updated styling. And there were further updates such as a 5-speed gearbox, 12-volt electrics and an electric start. The internal dimensions were pretty much the same, although compression was now 9.4 to 1 and claimed peak power was 15 horsepower at 10,500 RPM. While on the later S models at least, there were drum brakes front and rear, and this had to stop a 133 kilo or 295 pound motorcycle. Although in 1976 in a major update, these would be replaced by a front disc brake, with the introduction of the J model, which featured improved performance from larger carburetors, and an all-new 2-piece cylinder head. The machine would continue pretty much as is through until the end of the 70s and into the early 80s, when it was replaced by the all-new CB125 Super Dream, which featured an all-new engine and a restyle to match the larger bikes in the range. The Moto Guzzi Stornello. In 1957, Moto Guzzi withdrew from Grand Prix racing. Their chief designer, Giulio Calcano, turned his attention instead onto the development of a new range of road-going machines. This would famously result in the development of the V-twins, but there would also be smaller capacity road bikes too, including the Stornello, or Starling in English. Designed to minimise manufacturing costs, the design incorporated many new features for Moto Guzzi. The single-cylinder engine was tilted forward by 25 degrees, the push rods operated through rockers through 2 parallel valves, and the lubrication system was wet sump, and featured gear-driven primary drive to a 4-speed gearbox. With its lightweight, the little machine offered similar performance to the 235cc Lodolo, but was 45% cheaper, and not surprisingly was a sales success. The engine was of 123cc with a bore and stroke of 52x58. On the early models, compression ratio was 8 to 1, and peak power was just 6.8 horsepower at 7,200 RPM, but this would increase throughout the 1960s, going initially from 10 and eventually to 12 horsepower. Early performance was around 60 miles an hour, with nearer 70 on the later models. There would also be a larger 160cc version and scramble variants too. Final versions of the Stornello arrived in 1970 and featured a completely revised engine, with more power and a 5-speed gearbox. But this machine would only last until 1974. Ducati's 125 Turismo and Sport. After starting life as a producer of radios, post-war Ducati had built a 50cc engine designed to be fitted to a bicycle frame, before developing a scooter, that's right, a scooter in 1953. 1957, however, would see the introduction of the Taglioni-designed 125. The engine was 124.4cc with a bore and stroke of 55.2x52. There was overhead cam with bevel drive, although compression ratio was a fairly modest 7 to 1, and peak power was only around 7 horsepower. So despite the aggressive looks, the little 4-speeder only actually went around 55 miles an hour at the top end. Although of course by 1950 standards this was still pretty good, and the bike did sound rather brilliant. The Turismo would run until 1965, although by this point it had been joined in the range by the 125 Sport. The Sport model arrived in 1961. This model featured a number of upgrades and was in fact based on the larger 175. So while the bottom end of the engine was essentially the same as the Turismo, the new top end featured desmodronic valve gear and a raised compression ratio of 8 to 1. This gave the new machine 10 horsepower at 8,500 RPM, giving a top speed of just shy of 70 miles an hour. Production of the Sport would end in 1964, and the production of all narrowcase singles would end in 1967. However, the narrowcase 125 would return to the range briefly in 1971 in the form of a Ducati Scrambler, although the engine was actually built in Spain by Motortrans. The Morini Corsaro. The Morini Corsaro, which incidentally means pirate, was introduced in 1958 and is very similar to the slightly larger Settebello. There were in fact several versions of the 125, but the Corsaro is probably the best styled. The engine was an air-cooled 4-stroke with overhead valves and was of 123 cc's with a bore stroke of 56 by 50. Peak horsepower is quoted at 9 horsepower, which was fed through a 5-speed box, something not that common in 1958 it must be said, to give a top speed of a claimed at least 67 miles an hour or 108 kilometers an hour. And the drum brakes were pretty effective at stopping the 90-kilo bike. Given the company's great reputation in lightweight racing, the chassis is not surprisingly excellent. But the machine's high quality and up-to-date features such as gear primary drive and of course that 5-speed gearbox made for an expensive motorcycle. And so the Motorini, like the other Italian bikes here, do prove that a bike does not have to be a large capacity to be exotic. The Gilera Giubileo. The Giubileo, or Jubilee, which is one of a range of 4-stroke singles introduced by Gilera from a prototype first seen in 1948. These simple overhead valve machines were developed into sport and turismo models, and the engine was available as a 150 and later a 175 also. The Giubileo name was first used in 1959 to mark the golden jubilee of the company's foundation. Although by the mid-60s only a handful of 125 bikes were actually being completed, the 175 and 150 proving much more popular. The Turismo made just 6.5 horsepower, but the sport model with its 10.5 to 1 compression ratio did make quite a bit more and claimed a top speed of around 68 miles an hour. Similar to the other Italian machines here, there's a gear primary drive and a 4-speed gearbox, but the success of the 150 and 175 versions would see the 125 phased out at the end of the 60s. But in 1972 the 125 would return in the guise of the Accord. This ran essentially the same engine but considerably and stylistically updated, with increased performance and a 5-speed gearbox. Like the early machines, the Accord was available as a 125 and a larger 150, and would remain on sale until 1979. One of the bikes or collections of bikes would you like to see us feature in a future video? Perhaps you've got a bike we can use for a test drive. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.